I just need one.
Well, she's taking pictures of it. I'll go. I don't care.
We're going to get started in 1 minute.
Is he the probate attorney or is he?
We just twisted a little bit this way.
From the ring guy.
Yeah, actually. I don't want to mess it up. There's a camera everywhere.
Wow.
Of the explosion yesterday? Good reason to redo it today.
Where's the legal section for Rocks?
Don't say that,
Where's
John.
that section for Rocks?
Southern Boulevard down there.
No, they have doorbell camera now.
183rd? No,
No,
that was
that was
the
the
other
other
one.
one.
No, it was Southern Boulevard.
What blew up?
It's pretty far south.
Okay. I never heard that before.
That's scary.
It was the old Ford factory. Jimmy Carter's the old housing in the 80s. Also on the Bronx was. Talking about the 70s.
We'll close the door too, so you can. Yeah. We'll let Laura in first. You got everybody in? You can stand on this side too, so we have a little more room. On this side of the. There you go. All right. Good morning. As you all know, on November 1st, 2021, a grand jury in Westchester County indicted Robert Durst for the 1982 murder of his first wife, Kathleen McCormack Durst. In an effort to provide as much transparency as possible, my office is issuing an investigative report, which we are releasing today, because a public trial is no longer possible due to Mr. Durst's death. This report summarizes facts not subject to grand jury secrecy that were gathered during the investigation into Kathleen Durst's disappearance, and it sheds some light on why it took nearly 40 years to charge Robert Durst with her murder. These are all things about which there has been great speculation over the years, and I believe that sharing facts where possible with the public is the best possible way to enhance public trust in our criminal justice system. I established our office's first cold case bureau to investigate Westchester's more than 100 cold case homicides. Why? Because victims deserve justice, offenders must be held accountable, and because we can learn from what was done and not done in these cases to better serve victims in the future. Shortly after I took office last year, the Cold Case Bureau and the New York State Police resumed the investigation into Kathleen Durst's disappearance. As a result of the work by these lawyers and investigators, Robert Durst was finally charged with murder in the second degree. And, as is often the case, with hindsight and broader knowledge, we are able to see now how some missed opportunities by law enforcement officials directing the early stages of the investigation may have contributed to delay in bringing the charges in this case. As detailed in our report, following Kathleen's disappearance on January 31st, 1982, Robert Durst made a number of statements to police that were contradicted by other evidence. This evidence included multiple reports of incidents of domestic violence by Durst against Kathleen, including with a gun, physical evidence in the Durst South Salem home, and statements by witnesses disputing his whereabouts immediately after her disappearance. And yet, the focus of the investigation remained guided by Durst's version of events, that he had driven her to the train to New York City on the night she disappeared. Most significantly, reports that eyewitnesses had placed Kathleen in Manhattan were debunked only after New York State Police investigator Joseph Becerra got involved in the investigation almost 20 years later. Further, in the initial investigation, great reliance was placed on a phone call, supposedly placed by Kathleen to her medical school after her disappearance, which falsely suggested she was still alive. Many years later, evidence was developed that showed that this call was in fact a ruse that Durst had orchestrated using his friend Susan Berman. As we now know, Durst later murdered Berman in December of 2000 in order to keep her silent, and he was ultimately arrested by authorities in California in 2015 and successfully prosecuted for that murder. That conviction had significant implications for our office's ability to bring charges. Specifically, under New York law, Durst's conviction provided new, legally admissible evidence that Durst had directed Berman to call the medical school, pretending to be Kathleen in order to misdirect the investigation, and legally admissible evidence that Durst had admitted to Berman that he killed Kathleen Durst. With these two new pieces of evidence, our office was able to charge Durst with Kathleen's murder. Those of us in law enforcement who are always seeking to do better by victims can and should look at how this case was handled and what, if anything, we can learn about the crucial early stages of criminal investigations, especially those where individuals with status, wealth, and power are implicated. By learning from past investigations, we can better assure the public that no one is above close scrutiny of law enforcement, and we can better help domestic violence victims like Kathleen Durst and so many more. In our view, the initial investigation in this case demonstrates the danger of what's known as tunnel vision, having a theory of a case which is maintained even when there are red flags that should cause those initial theories to be questioned. While the investigation focused on Manhattan initially, that should have changed more quickly as more facts came to light. It did not until almost 20 years later, thanks in large part to investigator Becerra. That may have led to significant missed opportunities to obtain physical evidence outside of Manhattan. While the pivot was ultimately made by multiple investigators and departments who made crucial contributions to the investigation into Kathleen's murder, we can and must all learn from this investigation so that we can improve our processes moving forward. This case should also serve as a reminder that domestic violence cases are often cases based in deception and secrecy, where the details of what occurred cannot always be proven by evidence from outside the home. And so decisions about whether a prosecution is possible should be approached with that lens in mind. In the end, I hope that the charges here that were ultimately brought send a powerful message that no one is above the law and no victim's case should be forgotten. I'd like to take a moment to recognize first members of my office who worked so diligently on this case and had the courage to tackle something this old and this challenging. First, Cold Case Bureau Chief Laura Murphy. Chief Investigator Dan McKenna. Bureau Chief Nadine Nagler. Bureau Chief Maria Wager. DA investigators Marie DeAngelo, Lethea Smith, who are up here, and Dan Higgins, who is back there. Law intern Catherine Faselli, as well as retired DA investigator Edward Murphy Sr. I'd also like to recognize New York State Police Major Catherine Rohde and Captain Christopher Mulkins, and now former investigator Joseph Becerra, who has dedicated 22 years of his life to investigating Kathleen Durst's disappearance. We would not be here today but for his work on the case beginning in 1999, and but for the willingness of the New York State Police to dedicate resources to the investigation that we resumed in 2021. The whole team worked collaboratively with the FBI, the Westchester County Department of Public Safety, Westchester County Department of Laboratories and Research, and other law enforcement agencies from across the county and country. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, who also assisted us in the investigation. And now I can open it up to any on-topic questions that anyone has.
Were there any members of the McCormack family invited today?
We have been communicating through their lawyer as directed.
And Bill Stevenson, Jill Biden's ex-husband, told us that he directly witnessed Robert Durst make violent threats about Kathy, and she disappeared less than a week later. Was he interviewed by your staff, and why wasn't his commentary included in the grand jury proceeding?
Well, I can't comment on grand jury materials. As to the question about Mr. Stevenson, I'll let Lori answer.
So we considered what,
Please.
oh, sorry, yes. As far as Mr. Stevenson goes, we had a very thorough summary of what he had to say. Our case, we very much wanted to focus on what happened to Kathleen, how Kathleen disappeared, and the surrounding facts. We as a team made a decision on what witnesses were the most important to interview and what could bring us forward into a grand jury. And again, the grand jury was step one. We would have been moving towards a trial, and obviously further interviews would have happened at that time. Beyond that, I'm not going to comment.
You interviewed, however, his best friend who was there.
I'm not
when
going
the
to
threats
comment
were made.
further on who we
Okay.
interviewed.
What about Deborah Sheridan, Robert Durst's current wife?
But I just want to make, one other point in response to that question. There's no question here that Kathleen Durst was a victim of domestic violence, and we have evidence, I'll say overwhelming evidence, that would have proven that, and that's really what's important. Sorry, what was your other question?
Have you interviewed or reached out to Deborah Sheridan, Robert Durst's current wife, who is also
We're
been
not
the
gonna-
subject of allegations?
We're not going to comment on that either.
And what new evidence did you uncover through the Los Angeles trial that enabled you to proceed with the grand jury in Westchester that was not known before the trial? Because through watching the trial, it did seem like a majority of the topics that were brought up were things that were covered by Mr. Becerra there 2 decades before.
So, as I said, I mean, this is a case that really was a 40-year investigation in a lot of ways. There isn't any one point at which all of a sudden there's a smoking gun. It's a circumstantial case, a circumstantial murder case. And what our team did beginning in January 2021, when I took office, and this team was formed and put together and dedicated the right resources, people, and time to it, is first of all really fine-tuned a lot of the evidence that already was somewhat known but needed to be dug into in a deeper way. We re-interviewed witnesses, some of whom were more forthcoming than before, maybe because Durst was at that point in custody and facing trial in Los Angeles. We did find some new witnesses who would corroborate a lot of the theories that we found compelling and evidence that we found compelling. And we did uncover some new physical evidence, again, that was corroborating of the circumstantial case. And most importantly, as I said in my remarks, because of the conviction in Los Angeles and the fact that he was convicted of killing Susan Berman in order to silence her, because she was a potential witness against him, we now had finally a legal theory under which we could get statements that he had made to others through Susan Berman into evidence, namely that he had directed her to make that ruse phone call to the medical school shortly after her disappearance to misdirect the investigation, which is obviously a key piece of consciousness of guilt, as well as other types of evidence, and that he had in fact admitted to Susan Berman that he had killed Kathleen. So those were sort of two very critical pieces that we now had a legal basis to seek admission here in New York.
Did the evidence point to anything that would suggest where
Kathy's remains are at this point?
We have theories based on some of the evidence. We can't really comment on what the evidence is. As the district attorney said, some evidence we received was pursuant to a grand jury investigation. So yes, some of the evidence did lead to a theory of where she could be, but I'll leave it at that. I can't comment further.
Can you say what evidence is being released to the public at this point? And then at any further point, is more going to come out?
I mean, the report is 12 pages, and it summarizes a lot of the evidence. I don't foresee other evidence coming available at any point. In fact, I think we're sort of in a window now where we have the ability to issue a report like this. The case will be sealed once it's dismissed, which will happen once we have a death certificate for Mr. Durst. And, you know, unless new evidence comes to light. I mean, we always leave open that option, but I don't really anticipate that in this case.
Mr. Abrams, the McCormack family attorney, has alleged that the Durst organization and other members of Robert Durst's family were involved in an initial cover-up in the days after Kathy disappeared. Did you investigate that or have any thoughts on that?
We have no evidence to start an investigation of that nature.
Do any of the investigative materials point to Connecticut in any way? I know there was, she had some connections to that state.
The investigation, there was allegations from him that he was in Connecticut on the days following, but other than that, no.
For Investigator Becerra, after working on this for so long, was there satisfaction that the murder charge was brought? Did his death kind of make it bittersweet that it didn't play out to the end, to the conclusion?
Definitely was bittersweet. We all worked long hours, long years on this case. I guess the biggest disappointment is not knowing where Kathy is, just so we can give her family final closure.
Mr. Becerra, while you're up there, what role did the former district attorney Jeanine Pirro play in this case not going to a grand jury 20 years ago?
I can't comment on that. Thank you.
All right.
We did receive one question over email from Tony Aiello at CBS. He was asking if there are any specific concerns about the handling of the case by former DAs.
That's a very broad question. As I said before, we have no evidence to conduct any kind of investigation, and I'm focused on what my team did once I got here. I'm very, very proud of all of them and the work that we did. And I just think it's really important in Kathleen's honor to focus on domestic violence victims everywhere and trying to better serve them before it's too late.
Can you say anything about the period from November of 2000 till September of 2001? Can you talk about anything in there, because that was such a crucial time with two other killings in the case. Was there anything, any missteps there, anything that was, was not done that you've discovered?
I mean, look, this is not, as I said, I think in my remarks about putting blame anywhere. I did point to things that I think very early on in the investigation, we would have liked, looking back, to have seen done. Would we have liked them to, drill down more in the beginning on the witnesses who claimed to have seen her in New York City in the apartment building that Investigator Becerra later was basically able to debunk? Yes, I would have liked that to happen earlier. Would we liked to have seen them drill down more on this supposed phone call, which left open this possibility that she was still alive? Yes, I wish all of that had happened sooner. It's hard to say right now, standing here at this point, why it didn't. But I think it's an important thing for us moving forward. I don't think that anyone here did anything intentional. But there's always hindsight, Monday morning quarterbacking is easy to do in investigations. And so we can look at the path of the case as a whole and wish that some things had been done sooner.
I might have missed this earlier. Is there any indication in the record, in the file, whether Susan Berman was ever asked about that phone call?
Meaning,
The phone call to Einstein.
no, but you're asking whether she was ever asked before she was killed.
By law enforcement?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Law enforcement hadn't interviewed her as of the time of her death.
Even back in the year in
Even-
1982, nobody had ever talked to her.
That's my understanding, yes. Correct?
Yes.
Can you speak to the nature of the physical evidence you said you had? Was there any, DNA evidence that pointed to his involvement in her death?
So, as I said, I think part of these missed opportunities in the beginning may very likely have led to missed opportunities in obtaining physical evidence. There was not a thorough search done of the Westchester home near the time of her death, of her disappearance at the time, as it was called. We, at this point, later when we renewed the investigation, were in the process of trying to take advantage of advances in certain DNA technology to see if there was something that we could use to corroborate some of our other evidence. But that now will not happen because of his death.
And has the murder weapon ever been found?
No.
What is your message for you and for Mr. Becerra, if you could both answer this question? What is your message directly to Kathy's surviving siblings? Her parents passed away years ago.
Sure. I mean, I've said before and I'll say again, my heart goes out to them, obviously, first, as it does to all victims' families for their loss, and to the added pain of having to not have closure for this long. I mean, we all standing here as members of law enforcement work every day to give closure to families of victims, and so we really understand how much more painful that can be. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have a trial to have them see, hopefully, what we believe would have been an ultimate conviction on second-degree murder of Mr. Durst, but we hope that at least the bringing of charges brought them some closure. They have expressed in the past to our team that it did, and we hope that that remains so.
And Mr. Becerra, can you answer that question as well, please?
Back in 1999, when I reopened the case, I got to know Kathy's family very well. Very loving, nice family, and you could tell the heartbreak they had after all those years of not knowing what happened to Kathy. I did make a promise to them that I would see it through. I'm a little disappointed in the end, just the fact that we couldn't bring him to trial and the fact that we don't know where Kathy is. But I'm hoping they'd appreciate all the work that went into this case and that it would bring them some closure.
I saw you're getting the wrap, just another quick one, I'm sorry, I apologize. What stage, or what part of the process were you in with California in having him brought to New York to stand trial?
We had served the papers that would require them to have him transferred here. So that's the stage we were at.
Had he put in any position on that, and did he challenge that at all through a lawyer or anyone?
No.
It hadn't yet appeared in court. We had filed the forms from the interstate agreement on detainers to bring him to New York. He had refused to sign the forms, and we were in the process of having it brought into court in California. The DA's office in the county where the prison is would be the ones who would bring that into court to
Was
have
your
that done.
team ever asked to hold off on bringing this to a grand jury in Westchester by the prosecutors in California until their trial was completed?
The short answer is no, we don't need to be asked. Prosecutors' offices coordinate all the time on which cases should go first based on the strength of the case, who has better physical evidence, like a body in a homicide case. There is nothing unusual about that. I can say that based on my, almost 20 years in as a prosecutor in various jurisdictions. It made sense for Los Angeles to go first, and in fact helped and strengthened our case. Once I came into office, that trial was already, in fact, proceeding. It then had a hiatus because of COVID, and we used that time to further our investigation. Right. I
Thank
think
you, everyone.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief.
Nothing else is happening. Thank you, everyone.